Welcome to the Real Stuff podcast, everybody. Today's episode is a pretty heavy one. Frankly, it's a little sad, it's very serious, but there are a lot of incredibly positive moments and reminders, and I highly recommend that you give yourself the space and time to listen to this one. Jordy Glassner is a friend who I've made through another friend. In the episode, we get into a little bit how we first connected, and her story is really hard for me to hear specifically as a person who's in such a similar stage of life as Jordy. We both became moms around the same time. Her son is just around Milo's age. It's one of those stories that as a listener, you can't not, put yourself in her shoes and just imagine what it must feel like to be going through what she's going through. And for Jordy, she lived most of her life, very much the same way, thinking things like this wouldn't happen to her and feeling kind of immune to the roller coaster of life. I personally felt during this interview like I was choked up during most of it. Felt as if my throat was closed. And of course, part of that came from not exactly knowing the quote right words to say at different times, but also I was just on the verge of tears at multiple moments. I don't actually crack and cry, but I do think you will notice that my voice sounds a little off. I actually could hear it coming out of my mouth sounding strange. So I don't know. I'm recording this intro the same day right after we spoke, and I feel like I'm still feeling that way. So I feel like my voice just doesn't feel normal right now or sound normal at all. But you will hear Jordy on this interview as an absolute ray of sunshine. She is so well-spoken for an audience guest who talks about how she is a little bit more on the introverted side and doesn't like public speaking. She is so well-spoken and a very good public speaker. And she's really just a reminder to all of us to enjoy the lives that we are blessed to live every day, to form as strong of connections as we can, and to forge tight relationships and really just celebrate every single day that we have here. After we ended the call, we actually spoke a lot, just the two of us, about the concept of death. And I opened up to her about some recent existential thoughts I've had about death. And the conclusion we came to is that even though she is living in her life right now with kind of a timeline, she doesn't really have answers, but she has more of a timeline than the average person is given about how long their life is going to go on. But the truth is, nobody knows how much time they have. And what I was finding kind of fascinating was that there are probably people who are listening to this podcast right now who are hearing Jordy's story and her saying how many more years she might have to live, thinking they have all the time in the world, and something could happen to one of these listeners tomorrow that ends their life. And I know that's incredibly grim. I don't want people to shy away from this episode because they have a fear of death. I feel like this is one of the most taboo topics and something that's so incredibly hard to talk about. And I just hope that this conversation can make you feel something as a human and realize nothing is guaranteed. Our lives are all about making of them what we can, getting the most out of every moment. And Jordy is certainly leaving an incredibly strong legacy, specifically with the new content she's been creating. So you can find her on Instagram at Jordy Glassner. I'm going to put a link to her Instagram in the show notes, as well as all of the links that we mentioned in the episode to various glioblastoma donation organizations and places that you can just donate to help out. And she mentions a gala that's coming up in June. I'm pretty sure this episode is coming out way before then, so we will link everything down below. Thank you so much again to Jordy for coming on, for telling this story, which I'm sure can be incredibly emotionally draining to discuss on repeat. And let's get into it. Today's episode with the wonderful Jordy Glassner. Jordy, welcome to the Real Stuff podcast. I'm so grateful that I met you, and I just want to give a little shout out to my friend Deb, who introduced us a little while ago. My understanding is that Deb and her husband are friends with you and your husband, and when this whole story came out about what was going on with you, she reached out to me because you wanted to connect about how you could start creating content. And I offer, private coaching and consulting, and decided to give you a free coaching session on how to create content around this bizarre, incredible, and horrific journey that you're going through. And now here you are creating a whole new world of content about your story. But for people who haven't seen this story, they don't know what I'm talking about. Can you tell us who you are and what has been going on in your life?
Yes, my name's Jordy, and shout out to Deb and Harel. I went to kindergarten with Harel, so we've been friends since we were like 5 years old, and I love Deb. And essentially in July of last year, I started having some like weird feelings in my left arm, just like numbness, a little bit of tingling. Sometimes if I was like going to change my son's diaper, I would like miss the tab, and I was like, oh, that's kind of weird, but you know, weird things happen in our bodies all the time. So I didn't think much of it. We were on vacation when I first noticed it. And then when I got home, it started to get worse. The arm became like my whole left side. And now it was like my leg. And then I started having these spasms. And so within like 6 weeks, I was starting to have like some more severe symptoms. I went to the doctor and he was pretty confident it wasn't anything neurological because I am a healthy, at the time, 31-year-old person. I've never had any like previous health history or anything like that. He did a check for like stroke symptoms. I didn't have any of those. So he sent me for a cervical MRI, which is like an MRI of your upper neck, just to rule out a pinched nerve. So I did that, ruled out a pinched nerve. And then he's like, okay, go to physical therapy. And so these like episodes kept happening, and then they started becoming more frequent. Like they'd happen 4 or 5 times a day, always returned to normal afterwards. And then one day it didn't return to normal. And I was like, this feels a little different. Like my arm just feels permanently like in this weird dead arm position. So I said to my husband, it was like 5 p.m. I'm like, okay, I'm going to like quickly drive myself to the ER, and you put Brody to bed. I'm sure I'll be home soon. And Brody's my son. And I'll see you soon. And so went to the ER, so busy. Doctor came and was like, you know what, it's so busy here. I just want to quickly do a CT scan just to rule out neuro. And then you'll go to your neurologist appointment, because I had made one, next week. I was like, okay, cool. So I go, I'm sitting in the hallway, get the CT scan, come back. And the doctor comes over and he's like, hey, so we see something on the CT scan. We see a mass on your brain. We don't really like know more information than that. We're going to need to do an MRI, but we're going to have to admit you. And I was like, oh, okay. And I just remember like my face getting really hot, and like it was like a very out of body experience. My husband's putting my son to bed, and I'm like watching on the Nanit camera, like, okay, I'm not going to say anything until he's asleep. Like my husband can like be fully turned off of that mode of being on as dad. And so right before my MRI, I called my husband and I just said, hey, I'm going in to get an MRI. They see something. They don't know what it is. And call my mom so she can come be with Brody, and you can come be with me. And so that's what happened. And they did the MRI, and very quickly we're like, yeah, there's a mass. It looks like a tumor. We don't know what kind. We don't know exactly what it is, if it's benign, if it's cancerous, but all we know is that there's a lot of swelling around it, and that's why you're having these symptoms. And what I was actually experiencing, these spasms, were seizures. I didn't know that at the time, because when I think of seizure, I think of like a grand mal seizure where you like lose consciousness, but you can actually have a seizure in like one specific part of your brain. And so where my tumor was, it was in the parietal lobe, which is like your sensory cortex and your motor cortex. And so I was having all these really weird sensory sensations. And honestly, like I just was in like fight or flight mode. And when I'm in that, I'm like fight, like I just go. And so I'm like, okay, like the next thing I need to do is just wake up from surgery. The only thing I was focused on was just getting through surgery. I couldn't see my son because they didn't allow children to come to the hospital. So that was like deeply upsetting. I'm just like going into this big surgery and like not knowing what was going to happen. And I remember sending texts to all my friends just being like, I love you. And I don't know. I believed I would be okay, but you just never know.
Did they tell you going into that, you know, the chances of it not going well?
I remember asking the doctor, like, so what if this, like, what if you don't get it? And he's like, no, it's not an if. He's like, we're gonna get it. He's like, but the main thing that you might be left behind with is like some sensory damage on the left side, because it's taking up most of your sensory cortex. Mm-hmm. So that's what I have. now. I have sensory deficit on my left side. It feels like my left side is swollen. It isn't, but it feels that way. That was the main concern that he said. Like, he was like, I'm not concerned that we won't be able to get it. I'm just, you might have permanent sensory damage. So I was just in acceptance mode of that. I didn't have time to think because it was like ER, quickly changed hospitals, and then surgery. And so I went to surgery. I woke up. I was relieved to have woken up. And then it was like a waiting game, you know? So they basically take your tumor and they test it and they send it over to a lab and want to see what it is and what kind of, if anything, if it's cancerous, if it's not cancerous, whatever. So that took about like 5 days from getting the surgery to getting a diagnosis. So those were a long 5 days.
Sure.
Obviously spent a lot of time like hoping for the best because I had felt so fine, you know, it just felt so surreal. And what I learned later was it was definitely not the best outcome. It was probably one of the worst outcomes you could have, aside from not being able to operate on it at all. It's glioblastoma, which is a grade 4 super aggressive brain cancer. I think like 5% of people with this live beyond 5 years. So like pretty grim, and there's been so much research and studying of this, but very little progress on the treatment side of like things that are actually effective. And so yeah, I remember I was in the hospital and I was like really kind of doped up on Dilaudid, and it was the middle of the night and my best friend had slept there with me that night, so Hank, my husband, could go home and be with our son. And in the middle of the night, I just got a report from the MRI that said like most likely GBM, and I didn't know what that meant at the time. So I like obviously went to Google and I was like, oh, okay, that's really bad. Okay. I'm like, I'm not going to like go based off of that. It just says most likely, but I like kind of knew deep down that it was like bad news.
Wow.
That it wasn't going to be good. Yeah.
At that moment, you get that text, you're with your friend, you go to Google. Do you just start going down the darkest rabbit hole possible?
For sure. For sure. Also, like I said, I was like high on drugs from my brain surgery. So I think that probably was helpful.
Probably.
Yeah, it was probably like calming my anxiety. Yeah, I just remember thinking like, oh, this is like worst case scenario. It couldn't probably get worse than this unless they couldn't have taken it out. And so then I'm like a research person. So that like brings me a lot of comfort typically. I'll like go deep into like research and like statistics and whatever. But like it was not comforting. Now like my doctor would tell me like, I didn't know this at the time, but he'd be like, don't go on Google. Like definitely don't go on Google. That's not your friend.
Once you actually speak to the doctor and they confirm or they tell you in person that this is what it most likely is or is, what's the next step from there?
Oh, it was the worst. That was the worst day of my life. That was definitely the worst day of my life. Having to give such horrible news to people that love you and care about you and are praying and like hoping so hard for something, and then just having to tell them it's like the exact opposite of what they were hoping for was like the most devastating. Having to call my parents and having to call my best friends were staying with my son that morning. I just remember calling them and they just burst into tears. Like we just knew like this was bad, and it's not like the kind of thing where like they remove it and you just move on with your life. It was like, oh, this is going to be like a big part of my life now.
In that it's going to be continuing to return.
In that I'm going to have to do a lot more treatment, right? It's not like you just get surgery and then you're cured. There is no cure. It's terminal. Like all those words that like you hear, you know? Yeah, that day was just like really heavy. And I just remember everyone, like my friends and family came over and we sat together, and my husband was like so distraught that day. I mean, it's like it's just your worst case scenario, you know? It's like your worst thing that you could dream up is happening in real life, and there's like you just have so little control. Like there's just nothing you can do. And so that was a bad day. But then I like went to bed and I woke up the next day. And I was like, "Oh, I'm still here. So now what do I do? Right? Like I've lived through my worst case scenario. Right. So like then what am I supposed to do with that? And so that's sort of when I was like, okay, I know I'm a therapist, by the way. I work with postpartum parents in a private practice, and I knew I was going to have to take time off from that, obviously. Had a lot of things ahead of me, and my head wasn't in the right place, and I wouldn't feel ethically okay to see clients in that state. I'm not a person that just like sits and does nothing. Like I need to be doing something productive, and I need it to be meaningful. So what can I do? And then I happened to be on Instagram scrolling through, and up pops Lucie's story about how she's like, I never talk about this part of my business, but I really love my one-on-one coaching, like with my clients. And I was like, oh, interesting. Huh. And like a little light bulb went off, and I was like, if anyone knows me in real life, like I would never put my face or like my voice or anything out there. I'm like very much more of like a wallflower. I like to blend in. I don't like to be the center of attention. And I was just like, how can I turn this into something that feels meaning making for me? And so I asked my husband, like, do you think this is psycho if I like ask Deb to introduce me to Lucie? And he's like, no, I think you should do it. And so that was it. And then I met with you, and we had a lovely conversation. You were so kind and so, generous with your time, and just gave me confidence that like I could put something out there that would be meaningful to people. And that's what's happened.
I am thinking back to the moment I posted that story set, because I remember thinking about how, I haven't shared this element of my business in a while, but this is something I love doing. And it was totally on a whim, and I posted it. And to think that there was some universal force at play that was going to get you to see that at that moment in time, which that's really been a big thing you've been working on lately. And a lot of your energy has been going into sharing your story in that way. And I'm sure it's been positively affecting so many people. You just talked about getting the worst news of your life, and everything you just told me was surrounding how it felt to tell other people, how bad you felt to tell your parents and your friends and your husband. I'm sure one day, or I'm 100% sure that one day wasn't enough time for you to process this almost in any way for yourself. But I'm curious about you.
It's a great question, and it's one that like people in my life ask me a lot. Like the first few weeks, I just remember my family and friends being like, are you okay? Like, you seem okay, and that's scaring me.
When I spoke to you, you seemed in such good spirits.
Yeah.
And I was, it was one of those moments of, I don't know if she already went through the processing, or if it hasn't hit her yet, or if she's never going to feel that way and she's just in this new state of consciousness. But I'm so curious what you were feeling.
It's all of it. I don't think it's linear. And that's what I've learned with this is like, I think in the beginning, it's like you get this set of news and you're like, okay, I'm going to like figure out my plan, right? And there's like so much to do. There's so many steps. It's like, okay, so I'm going to have surgery. Then I need to recover. And then I'm going to do physical therapy. And then I'm going to do radiation. And then I'm going to do chemo. And then I'm going to try and get into a clinical trial. And you have like all these steps along the way. And like I said, I'm a productive person. So like having a plan feels very safe to me. So I think in those early stages, the plan helped keep me afloat, right? Like even though it sucked to have to do all of those things, it was like something active that I was doing to fight against this thing in my brain. Then when there was a lull, so like when radiation and chemo ended after like 6 weeks, and I was waiting to start trying to get into this clinical trial, that was when it sort of sunk in like, oh, this is my life now, right? I'm not in this like doing stage. I'm just like having to be in it. And that was hard. No one would know this until you're in it, but it's like it seeps into every piece of your life, getting a diagnosis like this. I mean, I couldn't work, right? And that was like a huge source of my confidence and feeling like, myself and like having an identity outside of being a mom. I had taken a lot of time off of work to like be with my son, and having to like give that up after just starting it was like so devastating. So there was like a lot of grief in that. And then, you know, like the dynamic of your marriage changes because now I'm sick and we used to like be really great like partners and now I can do a lot less and I don't like admitting that I can do less. Every little piece of your life just like gets like tainted in a way. And I don't want to say it in like such a bad way because I think in some ways it's been really wonderful and like opened up a lot of doors for conversations that I wouldn't have had otherwise. But it's not just like you get the diagnosis and you do the medical stuff. It's like it seeps into every single piece of your life. And that was the part that I wasn't anticipating and the part that's been so exhausting. It's like life doesn't stop. You just have to like continue like being you and being a responsible adult and being a wife and being a parent and being a friend and a daughter and sister and show up in all those ways on top of like having this thing that's just like hanging over your head. And that was the part where I just didn't realize that, you know, until everything sort of slowed down and there was a lull.
And as you're going through this treatment, are you living in the hospital or are you still going home all the time?
No, so I only spent like 2 days in the hospital, which is so crazy. And then like the chemo that I took was oral, so it was like a pill that I took every night. And then the radiation, I went to like a radiation center like right by my house, and it was 5 days a week for 6 weeks. And so I would go and it was about 10 minutes each time. So super like fast, but I mean, it, you know, it knocks you out. Like you're pretty tired come like week 3 and 4. So it was like a cumulative effect.
So you are still obviously having to compromise some of the physical things you can technically do. But while all this is happening, you still have a toddler who is still doing activities. I don't know if he's in a school program. Your husband's still working. Mm-hmm. Everything around you is just kind of still happening like normal, and you are still in your normal environment. But everything for you is absolutely not normal.
Totally. And I will be honest and say prior to getting my diagnosis, like what I was working on in my own therapy was finding balance because I'm someone that likes to go 100%. And if I'm not going 100, I don't feel like I'm doing a good enough job. Like definitely a perfectionist in a lot of ways. And so I was really working on trying to figure out how do I find something that feels sustainable? How do I not feel burnt out? This forced my hand to really like reevaluate where I'm spending my energy and where I'm putting my time. And I wanted to do that before, and then I had to.
I don't know if you don't like to, in your own head, let yourself go to the worst case scenario, or if you have spent a decent amount of time, maybe in therapy or on your own, really thinking about the worst.
Yeah. So for me, and this is, you brought it up earlier, like, but what about you, right? My worst case scenario for me is seeing like the people around me struggle, thinking about my son not having a mom and like how that's going to ripple affect his life, you know, and like having that be part of his story, having a sick mom. That makes me so sad. I just don't want that for him because that's so hard. I don't want that for my husband, you know, like being a parent is hard and like being a single parent is hard and being a parent while your wife is sick is really hard. And it's just all of those things, like those are my worst case scenarios. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's like for me, I don't know when this is over, like it's over for me, but it's not over for everyone else who's still here, you know? And like they're left to like process and make sense of what this all was and what this all meant. And I feel like that is just what makes me the most sad. And so I think I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out like, do I live my life with urgency and like plan for the future? Or do I like stay present and spend time like just being really in the moment? That's a really hard balance for me. I don't know what pace to move at because there's so much uncertainty around my diagnosis. Like there are people who have this that are living with it for 20 years. It's rare, but it happens. And then there's people that live with it for 12 months. So, you know, it's a really wide range and it's different for everyone. So like there's really no predictor.
What would that look like for you if you said, I'm going to live with urgency or I'm going to be present? How would things change?
So, I mean, the urgency piece was like having conversations around like my will, right? And my medical directive, making sure that my husband and I were having conversations about things that you don't ever want to have conversations about. But I don't want him to be left with those decisions or question marks on his own. Like, I just don't feel like that's fair. I'm a hopeful, positive person, but I'm also a realist. And so I wasn't willing to like let my hope like make me a dreamer and not have them set up like for success.
Are you comfortable sharing if some of those conversations surrounded things like, do you want your husband to remarry if you're not around? That sort of thing?
Totally. Yeah. So we have what we call like, my last name's Glassner. So we call it like our Glassner Bible. And we have like a document of all the things. So like we did IVF at the beginning of my journey before I started radiation. Like what are we going to do with the embryos if we don't end up using them? And like what does dating look like, right? Like I just want him to be happy. Like he's such a wonderful person and I would never want life to stop because I'm not here. Like I want them to have the most beautiful life. I was like, my one request is that like you just don't introduce someone unless you're like really feeling like it's serious. And he was like, obviously. He was like a joke, like I have to get your best friend's like approval on like who would be the next one to come in. And so yeah, it's all written out in there. Hard conversations, right? Like parenting our kid, what do we want that to look like? What do we want for him from an academic standpoint, from a social emotional standpoint? If there are problems that arise, how do we want those to be dealt with? All these things that like when you have a 1.5-year-old, you're not really thinking about. You're like, just bogged down in like the day-to-day, like maybe tantrums and craziness. But I'm having to like sort of look beyond that and be like, how do I set my little family unit up for success if I'm not around? And so I have embraced that. I definitely have not shied away from it. And I think my husband would be comfortable with me sharing that like he was much more avoidant of that and like really not wanting to go there because it's a lot easier to just not think about it and to just go on like everything's fine. But I felt very alone in my like existential thinking when he wasn't joining me there. And so we had a lot of hard conversations about like, hey, I need you to go there with me. And like, I know it's uncomfortable, but we have to.
And then on the other hand, the living in the moment would be not really planning for any worst case scenario, but just going through life as if you don't have this diagnosis.
I think it's like both. It's like, I'm never going to go through life thinking that I don't have this. I want to live my life alongside it. And so I think for me, that's what being present is. It's like knowing my limitations and having to like listen to my body when it's tired, which is hard for me to do because I like to do things and now I have to slow down and that sucks. But I think it's that. It's like doing the things that I want to do and also being mindful that like I'm in a different place than I was before and I'm not capable of doing as much as I once was. And like being in acceptance of that has been a big challenge for me.
So you just talked about how your bigger fear is the way that this would affect those closest to you, because I think as you put it, once I'm not here, I'm gone. And it's not something that's weighing on me, but then it's ripple affecting everyone else. So that just brings me to the actual tangible idea of death and a fear, having a fear or not having a fear of that. As I've grown actually, and as I've known more and more people in my life who have passed away, the idea of death for me has gotten a lot less scary. And I would consider myself a spiritual person in that now that I know many people who I was close to who are on the quote other side, I almost think of it like this crossing of a line where now when someone I know and love passes, I almost think of them as joining these other people who are already there and who in some way are guiding them on that transition. Not to say that I am not afraid of the concept of it or the actual act of it, but I'm just curious where you stand mentally, emotionally with thoughts about the actual act of losing your life?
I think like I used to be someone who like that was a big fear for me. I was a big worrier. I would think about all the worst case scenarios. I would ruminate on things, like feeling like if I thought about it hard enough and long enough, like I'd be more prepared when it got there, you know? And I think what this whole experience has made me realize is that like you can't prepare for those things. They're just going to happen. And like death is one of the only guarantees that we have in this life. It's not an if, it's a when. Reframing it that way has actually been very freeing for me. Because before I felt like I was living my life as if I'm like trying to escape this thing. And it's like, it's not escapable. You can prolong your life, but at some point it will end. And I never really thought about it like that because like it's hard to live like that. Honestly, if you think about it like that, it's hard to find meaning. It's hard to find the will to like do the little things if you like get really existential. I'm not a religious person either. And I don't even know if I'm a spiritual person. I'm more just like rooted in like relationship and community with people. And I think like for me, I know like my mom lost her mom when she was young. She was 20, and you know, like she's been able to like keep her memory alive. And for me, like that's more important like than really thinking about the actual like act of dying. It's like, how do you preserve your legacy and how are you remembered and how can you make people feel like they knew you even if they didn't. And so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the actual like act of dying because to me it's like gonna happen at some point regardless. And if I spend a lot of time thinking about it, it's not gonna make it different. It's not gonna change the fact that it's gonna happen. I'm just gonna spend time thinking about that when I could be doing something else more productive.
I was gonna ask if you feel like you kind of toggle back and forth between having that incredibly healthy, positive, ideal mindset about it and simultaneously having moments of total rage and anger and feeling like you've been robbed.
Yeah, I definitely have moments like that. I think, how can you not, right? I don't really think about like why me or like why did this happen to me? Like bad things happen to people, good people all the time. And I'm just in that category of like unlucky. My rage is like in what I can't do that I used to be able to do. Like in the now, not like what I'm going to miss later. I'm like very focused on the now, like because that's all I have control over. So it's like if I'm too tired to like play with my son, like that's really upsetting to me. When my son cries out for me, like in the middle of the night, like, you know, sometimes I'll have that thought, like when he says like, I want my mommy. And I'm like, well, what if I wasn't here? And like the desperation in that, you know, and like just knowing like how hard that is and like how he's young and like won't understand that breaks my heart a bit. But for the most part, I spend my time really just thinking about like, how can I make these moments that I'm here meaningful and fun and memorable for the people around me.
On that note of your son, how much or how little have you shared with him? I know he's so young.
He's so young,
Does he know anything?
I mean, he knows I sometimes wear this device on my head and it like, I look like a robot when I wear it. And he at first he's like, take it off, mommy. And I'm like, it's mommy's hat. She can't take it off. But he doesn't know anything. And like, I kind of love that. Like, and it makes me feel good that like, he doesn't know that anything's different or wrong. I know that in the future, like, as he gets older, I'll have to explain a lot more to him. And depending on like how things go and whatever, you know, that will really dictate how much he needs to know and at what point in time. But yeah, he doesn't have any understanding. I mean, he's not even 2. So right now he's just really into like buses and cars and
all
swinging,
the typical little kid things.
All the little boy things. Yeah. So, and you know, he just wants me to play with him. And yeah, I kind of love that he doesn't see me. He sees me for me. Right. And he doesn't see me like through the lens that like everyone else in my life now sees me, which is like a patient, you know?
If you follow me on Instagram, you already know that I'm a massive fan of LMNT. These are the electrolyte drink mix packets that have 0 sugar. Michael and I have had a subscription to LMNT for over a year now, and each stick pack gives you a meaningful dose of electrolytes without any sugar, artificial colors, or any other sketchy ingredients. My all-time favorite LMNT flavor, which I was definitely skeptical of at first, I have to say, is the chocolate salt, which is meant to be mixed with hot water. I have it before bedtime in a cup of hot water. It is the tastiest 0 sugar, salty hot chocolate drink in the entire world. It also has all the magnesium that I've been wanting before sleep during this pregnancy. I sometimes throw some marshmallows in there. Ooh, it's amazing. And for the daytime, I really love the grapefruit salt flavor in a cup of ice water. I even sometimes used to put it in a seltzer. But you might have seen on my Instagram that they recently came out with a new product, which is LMNT Sparkling, which is basically what I've been doing with the seltzers, but now it comes pre-mixed in a can. And the black cherry lime, chef's kiss. Get your free sample pack of LMNT today with any LMNT drink purchase at drinklmnt.com/realstuff. Also, try the new LMNT Sparkling, no sugar and also no caffeine. That's drinklmnt.com/realstuff. And on the note of kids, going back to the freezing egg. So when I had first spoken to you, that was something that you had just gone through or you were just about to go through. And that was very interesting to me. It didn't even cross my mind. I guess that's something that some people turn to before chemotherapy so that they can preserve fertility. Yeah. Can you sort of talk about why you chose to do it and what you did?
Totally. Yeah. So one of the first meetings I had with my oncologist was basically like, hey, we have a few weeks till you're going to start chemo and radiation. This is the point in time where we talk to our patients about like preserving their fertility, because chemo and radiation can impact your ability to have children in the future. It can impact your egg quality, your ability to get pregnant, all that kind of stuff. I knew just who I am, that like being pregnant again, first of all, I didn't really enjoy it the first time. If I'm being completely honest, it was not for me. Yeah, I love my son, but I did not feel good. And so not only that, I would have had to like really rev myself up to do it again. But knowing that I like have this thing that could come back at any moment, and then I would potentially have to make a choice between like me and the baby, was just setting me up for a whole other level of trauma that I just don't need. And so I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do a surrogate in the future. And so I had like already made that decision and taken like pregnancy off the table for myself. And so that felt like nice to have some certainty around that. And then it just became about, like getting all the meds, meeting with an IVF doctor. Like I had to start right away. They even had to like rush my cycle, which is not ideal because you're trying to get as many eggs as you can. But like they didn't want to wait to start my treatment anymore, which made me feel like, wow, my cancer is like real bad.
Right.
Like I can't even wait one extra week for my cycle to be synced up to do this. So yeah, so I did the shots and it was fine. I'm like fine with needles. So the process was really okay for me. The procedure felt fine, cramping, a little bit of like bad period cramps afterwards. But the kind of crazy thing is, so I got like 23 eggs retrieved, but I only have 2 embryos. And so it's like, you just like don't realize like how quickly like those numbers get cut in half.
Is that because once they were kind of mixed together, there were only 2 healthy embryos in there?
So basically there were like 5 embryos that like made it to the stage where you can test them for genetic issues. And then only 2 of those were healthy.
Got it.
Yeah, you end up with 2 embryos. It's like you got 2 shots. But I felt okay about it because I was like, you know what? At least I didn't get 0. If I had gotten 0, I would have been really bummed. I would have gone through all of that.
That would have been good for that moment in time.
No, that would have been bad. So even though 2 was like not ideal, it was like hope, And that was like a hopeful part of my journey, like thinking about expanding my family one day and like sort of like being able to imagine a future.
And just so that we can know what your thought process was with these embryos, obviously, in the best case scenario, the hope is that you and your husband can put those embryos in a surrogate and raise your future babies, the 2 of you, and that you can move on and have a healthy life with this baby. But in the worst case scenario of why you're freezing the egg and getting the embryo, have you discussed with your husband if you want him to use these embryos in your absence?
Yeah, so we wouldn't use them in my absence. Like I said he could, but he wouldn't. I think we would donate them to research, honestly. And really, like, the reason why I did it, it's like at that moment in time, I wasn't thinking about expanding my family. But I also wanted to, like, be hopeful that, like, in a few years from now, maybe the medical treatments will have improved, you know, and, like, maybe life expectancy will be longer. And maybe at that point in time, I will feel ready to have that conversation about, you know, expanding our family. And, you know, we always wanted more than one child. But, you know, like life is unpredictable. So, you know, you prepare and then you figure it out on the fly as it all unfolds.
Right this moment, I know you don't actually have statistical insights about what is going to happen to you. But with that 5% living past 5 years stat, do you find that you're going through your day thinking in your head of a certain timeline that you think is going to be your timeline? Or are you really like, it could be tomorrow and it could be in 5 years or 20 years? Like, are you in the dark or do you have any thoughts?
I'm in the dark. I mean, no one can give me answers. And that's like the kind of hard part about this. It's like, I think about other diagnoses, like, you know, and like some of them, like, while they're terminal, it's like they have a very clear trajectory.
Right.
And this just doesn't. I'm very young to have this type of cancer. It's very rare for someone in their 30s to have it. The median age is like 65 or something, you know? And so a lot of times it's found later in life and it's found too late or in a part of the brain where they can't operate. So like there's so many things that contribute to like those statistics. And I love my doctor because I told him like, I don't want a prognosis. Like, don't give me one. And he was like, I can't give you one. Like, you're a unique individual and I have no way of knowing what is going to happen. We're just going to take it one step at a time and see how you respond. And I so appreciated that because I felt like a lot of times there's like a lot of doom and gloom around this diagnosis, and understandably so. But like being given a timeline just didn't feel like it fit with my mindset. I've just tried to stop worrying. You know, like I spent so much time worrying and like my bad things still happened.
Has that been freeing to you in any way to feel like you're releasing general anxiety?
Yeah, 1000%. Yeah. I feel so much more in control of the things that I can control and so much less of a pull to try and control things that I can't. And like before, I feel like I really liked being in control.
And you realize that nobody has any control, but we're all living our lives feeling like we might.
As if we do. I was saying to my husband, like, if I could have like seen in like a crystal ball that I was going to have cancer, like brain cancer, terminal, right? Like my son was 15 months old when I got diagnosed. I think I would have chosen not to have a child, most likely, right? Like if I could have predicted that this is what my life was going to be, not having seen what it would look like post-diagnosis, right? But just knowing that that was in my future, I would have chosen differently. And I think knowing what I know now, I'm so grateful that I didn't know that, you know? And it's like a freeing thing to be like, oh, like not knowing actually gave me one of the best things I've ever had in life. And like if I had had all the information, I would have made different choices.
Right.
And like been worse off for it. And so I've just sort of let up some of that desire to like predict the future or control, because I think you can't make the best decisions for you with future information because you don't know how you're going to feel.
You know, with a lot of cancer treatments, specifically I think for older people that get cancer, you hear a lot about them sort of choosing between going through the treatments, which can be incredibly rough on your whole system.
Yeah.
Or choosing quality of life and saying, I'm just going to enjoy these last few years or whatever the time frame is while I can. I'm assuming that in your case, partially because of your age and your time in life, and also partially because of the uncertainty of your diagnosis and the potential timeline that you could be on. Was your stance on this, every and all treatments are happening, or was there ever a time when you thought, I just want quality of life if I can have it?
Yeah. So it's so funny you bring that up because I'm like sort of in the midst of that right now. So I was supposed to get into this clinical trial, and because I had like one low blood count number that's like not really even relevant, I couldn't get into the trial. And so then my options were very limited.
And what was that a trial for, like a medication?
So it was basically like an immunotherapy, specifically targeting like a mutation in my tumor. So like very targeted medicine. And so that like the idea of that gave me a lot of hope moving like through this whole process. And then I found out in about like December that like it was looking like that wasn't going to happen for me. Once that was off the table, I sort of learned that like when you're considered stable, which is what I am, right? Like they took out my tumor, my scans have all been clear, which is like great. That means I only have access to chemotherapy. I'm not qualified or eligible for any experimental trials unless my condition worsens. And so essentially I need to get worse in order to get more progressive care.
Right. In order to have a chance at getting better, you need to get worse.
Correct. And so not to say that like the chemo isn't going to do anything, but there are a lot of promising drugs out there, and I don't have access to those right now because I'm doing well, which is a good thing. But it's like this catch-22, It's like you're doing well, so then like you just sort of have to wait until things get worse before you can intervene. And I hate that.
And at this stage, how often are you going in for scans to see if you're still doing well?
Every 2 months.
Every 2 months.
Yeah, every 2 months. And so I just went in March. I'll go again in May, and just keep going. And then, I think when they say like you get to 5 years, maybe 3 to 5 years, then you start going every 4 to 6 months. They like space it out a little bit more. But those first few years, you go every 2 months. And so there's this device that's FDA approved for my type of cancer. And it's like this thing that you like stick on your head, and it has all these cords, and it hooks up to this backpack that has a battery source, and it's amazing. Like the statistics are really great. And so I was like, of course I'm going to do it. Like it takes your chances from like 5% to like possibly 25% of living beyond 5 years or beyond. And so I like did it. And the first week was really hard because a wearable device is no joke. Like you're hooked up to something 24/7. I sleep in it. Like I have to shave my head every other day. Your skin gets irritated. It's like low stakes given what the alternative is, but it's a huge lifestyle adjustment, right? And then like, and this with a toddler, it's like you have your diaper bag and you have to, and then the toddler wants to be picked up, and then you have the stroller, and it's like, and now I'm hooked up to this device, and it's just like this extra thing. I run out of batteries. It can't be in the sun. I live in Los Angeles, right? Like I need to get breathable hats. There's just like all these things. And so I was like very committed. And like the first month I wore it like 82% of the time, which is considered good, like very good. And then we went on a trip and I took it off because we were going to go skiing. And then I ended up getting sick. So I kept it off. And it's been so hard for me to put it back on. And so that's like that piece, right? That quality of life piece. I'm like remembering what it was like before I wore it, and I felt so free. And so it's really hard to like shackle myself back to that, knowing what kind of like life I want to live, which is like be an active, present, mom and person. I want to go to the beach. I live by the ocean. Like none of those things are really feasible with this device. They are, but it's hard. And so I've had to ask myself that question a lot, and like sort of reframe it as like good and bad, like, oh, I'm doing a good job of wearing it, or I'm doing a bad job of wearing it. My doctor's been very helpful in that, of sort of being like, hey, like anything you do is better than nothing.
Right. It's all good.
Yeah. It's like all helpful. Like, so like wear it when you can or when you feel like it. And I'm like so grateful to have access to it because a lot of people outside of the United States don't have access to it. But yeah, it's like one of those things where I'm just like, I thought I would be gung-ho all in. And I'm just realizing like it's such a burden. It's heavy. It hurts my back. Like it definitely interferes with my quality of life. And like I'm a young person and I'm saying that, so like I can't imagine being older and having to like go through that adding that into your daily routine.
Speaking of that hat and how you have to shave your head for it, and also how the chemotherapy made your hair come out, I know that I didn't know you before your diagnosis, but I did see your social media photos, and I did see that you had this beautiful head of hair, very long.
I loved my hair.
Flowing curly hair, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know that's such a big part of cancer treatments and hair loss specifically for women being a major identity loss in a way, and also just difficult as a woman. What was that like?
For sure. I think I had long hair for like a long time growing up. And then when I was like maybe in college when I like cut it short for the first time. And I think once I did that, I realized like, oh, it's just hair and it'll grow back. And that was very liberating to me because up until that point, it felt like a safety net, you know? Essentially, actually, the kind of chemo that I take doesn't make my hair fall out.
Oh, it doesn't?
It was the radiation. So like they're radiating directly on this spot.
Right.
So I was actually losing hair like only on one side of my head. And so I could have kept my hair, but it would have been a very interesting style, and I would have had to like, I wouldn't have had to do anything but like get like a topper or like something. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna take matters into my own hands. I hate brushing my hair and seeing all the hair come out. It's sticking to everything. What am I holding on to it for? Like, it's gonna be a long time before this part of my hair matches this side of my hair that's extremely long. And so I just was like, you know what? The only thing I have control over is like making the decision to not have hair. And so that's what I did. And I would have never in my life wanted to be bald. Like, never. I'm like, no, don't have the face for it. Don't have the head for it. No thanks. But, you know, this like puts things into perspective and you're sort of like, who cares?
But you actually look good. So
I know, that's really nice.
You look
really
great.
Nice. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I'm assuming that that's one loss in terms of identity, and I'm assuming parts of your femininity and just identity as a woman. Aside from your identity as a therapist and the way you were saying that brings a lot of confidence to you and makes you feel like you, what other parts of your life, or you can kind of dive into either of those, like which areas do you feel like you felt the most identity loss around?
I think just like being like a doer in my family. Like I have 2 siblings and like older siblings, and I've just always sort of like been the like go-getter. I have such little energy now, and so like I can't play that same role, and like that's been a huge loss for me. Figuring out like, okay, so if I can't do that, like then what value do I bring to the table? You know, if I can't show up in the ways that I used to show up, if I can't be that version of myself, then who am I? And again, I said I was working on this stuff before, right? So it's like I knew it wasn't sustainable and it wasn't feeling good, but this really made me like pump the brakes. I didn't have a choice. And so I think for me, it's sort of been like having to establish like my role in certain relationships, you know, like saying like, hey, like I know I'm usually the one who reaches out to make plans. I don't have it in me to do that right now. I don't have any hard feelings if we don't see each other, but like if you want to come over, just come over, you know? And like having to ask for that and like ask for help has been really hard.
Sure. The previous owners of our house left us their grill when we first moved here, but it was kind of old and rusted. We definitely considered getting a whole new grill, but just decided to get a new grate to put on top of it. And now it seems brand new, and Michael has been making us many dinners on this grill in the backyard. And let me tell you, suburban heaven. So naturally, I already picked out the perfect Father's Day gift idea for Michael, and that is a shipment from Omaha Steaks. Unlike previous Father's Day gifts that I've given him, I know this one will not go to waste. Plus, it's kind of like a gift for myself too. Omaha Steaks has a ton of options for you to choose from, including chicken and seafood, and every steak and entree is flash frozen, vacuum sealed, and then ready to prepare whenever you want to fire up the grill. Plus, it's all backed by their unconditional 100% money back guarantee. So whether your dad lives close by or far away this Father's Day, you can send him a delicious package with gift wrapping starting at just $89 using the promo code Lucie. Go to omahasteaks.com and use promo code Lucie, Lucie, for some exclusive savings. That's omahasteaks.com, promo code Lucie at checkout to save on exclusive packages starting at just $89. First of all, I just want to share that I know you and your husband, and also my friend Deb and her husband, have been working on a lot of fundraising for your specific type of cancer. Before I ask you this question, is there any place that we can drive people to for this fundraising cause?
Yeah, so there are a few places that you can go. There's this gala coming up in June, on June 9th. All of the funds primarily go to UCLA. They're working on these amazing trials for very targeted medicine, and I've been working with their foundation and that family. They're amazing. It's called the Stanford L. Kurland Research Foundation. So I can send you the link, and if you're in LA, you could buy a ticket to the gala if you wanted to come. It's at Italy in Century City. That, and then I've been working closely with someone named Amber, who is the glioblastoma research organization founder, and her dad died of glioblastoma in 2018, and she started this research organization. They've raised like over $1 million, and they're working on funding all sorts of projects.
So we'll put both of those links down in the show notes if anyone's interested. And if you're in LA, definitely, I mean, I'm going to donate from the East Coast, but if you're in LA and you want to go, time to meet Jordy in person and have a great night.
Yeah.
And on that note of fundraising, you do not have to share this if you're not comfortable, but I'm curious how much medical bills have cost thus far.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's so wild. So I'm very grateful through my husband's work. We have great insurance. And what we learned, which we didn't even know prior to this, is that he actually has this company that works with his insurance called Progeny, which provides fertility services. And so like we only had to pay very minimal out of pocket for the egg freezing, which is like such a blessing because that can be, $20,000, $30,000. And so we didn't have to worry about that cost. And then with the medical bills, met my deductible real quick. So we have a good like PPO insurance, thank goodness. But yeah, I mean, like $750,000 was billed to my insurance for my hospital stay and my ongoing care. I mean, it's just insane. I don't know what people do if they don't have insurance. I truly don't know. Like, I mean, you would have to file for bankruptcy. Like, I don't know what people would do. And that's what makes me so sad too. And why I think I like took to social media to like spread awareness and stuff, because I'm someone who has a lot of resources, like mental health resources and like a lot of support from family and friends. And I have all of my cognitive faculties in order. And a lot of times people don't have that with this, and they're older, and I'm tech savvy. I can like maneuver this, And even so, it's still hard. You still have to jump through hoops to do things like that. So like when someone doesn't have those things working for them, I understand how like it would feel impossible, like an impossible feat.
So one of my final questions here, as someone who doesn't know many people in my life that tell me they have terminal cancer, and of course, as you said, you feel worried to come tell people because you're concerned with how they're going to feel. From my standpoint and from other people's standpoint, I think we are so concerned with our reaction to a person that tells us this information. And, talking to you and having that conversation, I felt like my whole throat was just closed up because you don't know what to say.
Of course.
And you don't know if the person wants to hear you say, I'm so sorry, or and this conversation we're having is a little different because you're coming on this podcast where I'm going to ask you,
of course,
deeper questions. But when you're just talking to someone and talking to a friend and they don't know what to say, obviously there's no right thing to say, there's no wrong thing to say. Everyone's sort of processing what you're telling them. But from your standpoint, what do you like hearing people say? What to you feels like a good thing for people to respond with when someone tells them that they're in the situation you're in?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you bring it up because I like started a little series on my like TikTok and Instagram like called Don't Say That, which is I'm like joking, you know, but
Yeah.
I'm just sort of being like silly about it, but really trying to guide people towards like things that are more helpful and things that are maybe a little bit less helpful. I come from a place of like always assuming that people are well intentioned and that they don't know what to say. And so I will like never get upset about someone saying something that feels like maybe it doesn't feel great. I'm quick to give feedback. You know, like, hey, that didn't feel good, or hey, when you said at least blah blah blah, it kind of made me feel like you're minimizing my experience right now. So I think for me, what I've learned is that like everyone needs something different. And so like my answer isn't going to be the answer for everyone. What I would say is like just be there, check in, you know, like, hey, how are you doing right now? You know, not just how are you doing, but how are you doing right now? Because it's different from moment to moment, day to day, you know, and like what you need now might be different than what you need that like at another point in time. Just even sending a text. I like loved getting texts from people where they would be like, hey, just thinking about you, like no need to respond to this. It like took the pressure off, you know, of like having to get back to people because, you know, like people are coming out of the woodwork, you know, talking to you and it's so sweet and kind, but you feel overwhelmed, you know? And so just having people say like, hey, I'm just thinking about you. Send a little emoji, a heart, right? One of the reasons I started the social media thing too was just like I didn't want to have to give individual updates to everybody because it was a lot to like have to retell the story over and over and over again. It just feels taxing. And so finding ways to like disseminate information in a way that felt good, I felt like set me up better for success. So I would say like be like as the person who's going through something, I think like be vocal about what you need and what you want and what you don't want because people just don't know and it's not fair to expect them to because these are really extreme circumstances and no one is taught or prepared for how to deal with someone who has a terminal cancer diagnosis, you know?
Especially someone so young where just the whole story feels so heavy and tragic compared to, I mean, obviously it's still tragic when someone's older, but
of course, yeah.
Yeah, once they've lived their life and their children are grown up, it's a very different, you can't deny that it's a very different circumstance.
Yeah, exactly. It feels different as a young person to go through it for sure. Yeah, I would just say check in with your person, you know, like, and it's okay to get it wrong. I think it's okay to get it wrong.
I'm sure you very much so feel like your life, it's almost like a before that day you went to the hospital and drove yourself to the emergency room and after, and it's like delineated by this line. Are there ever moments when you feel like completely normal and that you almost forget about cancer, or is it kind of a constant thought in your head?
No, there are moments where I feel normal. It's so interesting. Like when I'm just like sitting talking with my best friends, I feel normal. Like I'm not even really thinking about it. The device is a physical reminder, so that made it harder too, right? Because up until that point, it was just sort of like, oh, I can wear a hat and like cover my bald head and no one would know anything. But yeah, without that physical device sort of reminding me, sometimes I forget. And I kind of love that like I could be living with a terminal diagnosis and sometimes forget that that's what's happening. Because like that's the thing, like life just keeps going. Like it doesn't stop just because your world gets rocked, you know? And so you just find ways to like live with it. And I recognize that it's very much a choice. Like people are always like saying like you're so strong and whatever. And it's so sweet like when people say that. It comes from a good place, but it's like I don't know any other way to be. Like I don't know how to be myself and exist in any other way. It just wouldn't feel like me.
Right.
And so I can't do that. So I'm just going to like do what I got to do to keep going and like let myself feel the things when they come up and feel sad about it and feel frustrated and angry. And then like say, and I'm still going to wake up tomorrow and have to get my kid out of bed and make breakfast and do all the things, you know, like life doesn't stop.
If you could leave our listeners with some Jordy words of wisdom, because you've obviously got a lot, what would you want to say to the world if you could just blast out one message?
Oh, just one message. That's so hard. Don't wait for your worst case scenario to do the things you want to do and live your life the way you want to live it. I think we're, as a society, really focused on the future, always planning for the next thing. And I think like there's a lot of hope in future-oriented thinking, which is positive. But I also think it's like we think about like retirement savings and all these things that like you're supposed to do. And it's like, at what cost? And that's what I want people to think about. It's just like, don't settle for like now, like for the future, because your future is not guaranteed. I may have more information that like my time is shorter, but no one knows how much time they really have. It's wonderful to operate in a way where you can like plan for your future and also like enjoy now, seize the day, because you don't know what could happen tomorrow.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for your time, for coming on, for talking about this topic that, as you said, can be very draining. And
yeah,
if anyone wants more information from you, let them know this social media handle where you're posting. And by the way, that series you made, I think it was called What to Expect When You're Not Expecting Brain Cancer.
Expecting brain cancer.
Brilliant title. What
That's my husband. All my husband.
Tell us about the series that you're producing now and just what's going on in that channel.
So essentially I'm sort of posting like as much as I can. Given that I have a toddler and life and I'm working again now.
And, you are. That's amazing.
I am, yeah. So I have like a small caseload of clients, which has been really nice and sort of different for me. I've had to self-disclose more than I ever have as a therapist, and that's been really interesting to sort of navigate. But yeah, I just, at Jordy Glassner, I'm posting updates about my like health journey, but also just trying to make people feel less alone in their experience. Like, it's kind of crazy. I've had a lot of people reach out that don't have cancer, nothing like health related, but they can fully like what I'm saying resonates with them so deeply. And I think what I realized is that grief is actually like at the core of a lot of what I'm talking about, right? So like loss of identity, loss of, you know, your physical beauty, like feeling feminine or those kinds of things, loss of the role that you played in a relationship now having to be different, in addition to like the classic types of loss that we think about, like death and the end of a relationship. I think there's like so much nuance in it, and people have picked up on that and like reached out and been like, hey, I know like my situation's totally different from yours, but like, how are you staying positive in this? I'm going through this thing. And I just realized there's like not a lot of spaces where people are talking about grief in that way. And so my best friend and I, she's a clinical psychologist, and we decided like she also has experienced some trauma and had a late term baby loss. And so we have decided to start a podcast where we sort of explore the different facets of grief in many different areas of life. So not just in loss or end of relationships, but in all sorts of things. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be recording a podcast. You inspired me.
Love it. Do you have a name for it yet?
Yeah, it's called Grief Street. We grew up on the same street.
Oh, that's so
and
sweet.
Grief sort of like, you know, wheedled its way into our life. And so now we're walking along it together, and it's been really nice to have a friend who knows what's going on. And as a therapist, obviously we have some tools and skills and foundation to like be able to be supportive. But I've just found that for the most part, like you said, most people don't know what to do, what to say, how to be there. And that leaves people feeling pretty lonely. So like finding a space where people can feel heard and like recognize themselves in other people's stories is sort of what we're trying to to do.
That's amazing. So we will link that too if the show is out by the time this episode comes out. And one last question, which doesn't have to do with glioblastoma. Now that I have a therapist here, I need to ask, because I have a therapist. I see my therapist weekly. And I always wonder if, from her standpoint, when she hears all these people coming to her with their life issues, if that makes her in her own life feel almost like centered and rejuvenated, knowing that everyone's kind of going through things, which was sort of my impetus with this podcast, was like, the more we hear that other people are struggling with things, the more we'll all sort of realize that we're not alone in anything. And so I wonder if that is helpful, or if therapists actually carry around so much weight that it's unhealthy for them. I'm so happy to hear you're back at work, if not only for your identity returning a bit, but does it just open up your mind to the fact that like everyone's going through something in some way?
Totally. And I think that's what drew me to this to begin with. You know, like that's why I went into this field, is because I wanted to just like connect with people and understand their experience. And so even more so now, I think in some ways it actually helps get me out of my own head, right? Yeah. And like it helps me, like I'm helping people problem solve things that can actually be solved. And that feels really good, you know, because there's a lot in my life that I can't do that with right now. And so to be able to give people tangible skills and things to practice and watch their life get better and their anxiety decrease and their depression lift, and like to help them see that they can actually like empower themselves and implement change in their own life is so rewarding. And so that's been like so nice to have. And I felt that way about it before, but especially now. But I will say, like, and maybe one day we'll get into this, but I actually left the field for a few years because I did get really burnt out. And I was having a really hard time sort of like compartmentalizing work and life and not taking that stuff home with me. And it felt really, really heavy. And so I don't feel that way now, but there was definitely a point where I did. And I think a lot of us therapists go through that, where it ebbs and flows.
Yeah, I watched the show Couples Therapy, and I noticed that the therapists had therapists to unpack everything.
Oh, yeah.
With. Yeah, seems healthy.
You have to. I mean, when I went to grad school, it was like a requirement that we had to be in therapy, like while we were going through the program. And you got to be willing to like practice what you preach, I think, you know, like willing to dig deep and look at the stuff. If you're going to be asking other people to do that too.
Jordy, you are such a special human. You're inspirational. Your outlook on everything, I hope, rubs off on other people who are going through really hard times in their life. And let's check out the description box of the podcast. I'm going to put Jordy's podcast. Be sure you follow her on social media.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your time, for your energy. I hope you get some really good rest after all this talking.
Thank you.
And please send my love to your husband and your son.
I sure will. Thanks so much for having me. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to The Real Stuff. I'm Lucie Fink. Don't forget to follow the show on social media at The Real Stuff Pod. And if you're liking these episodes, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a written review. It helps the show so much. And if you're feeling called to come on the show, visit luciefink.com/apply and tell us your story. We'll see you next week for another intimate conversation on The Real Stuff.